The rain in Seattle on that particular Friday morning was not just typical Pacific Northwest weather. It was a relentless, punishing downpour. It came down in thick, heavy gray sheets that washed the color out of the streets and made the towering glass structures of the downtown district feel like isolated islands in a vast, concrete ocean. I was sitting at a small, slightly unsteady corner table inside an upscale coffee shop located directly across the street from my luxury apartment building. The black coffee in my paper cup had gone entirely cold at least 20 minutes ago, leaving a bitter, metallic taste in the back of my mouth that I could not quite swallow away. But I was not sitting there for the coffee, and I was certainly not there to enjoy the gloomy morning view. I was there with a singular, calculated purpose. I was there to watch a broken system finally collapse. I kept my heavy dark wool coat on, the collar turned up against my neck, deliberately blending into the background noise of morning commuters, frantic baristas, and the hiss of the espresso machines. My eyes were entirely locked on the glowing screen of my mobile phone, which was resting flat on the scratched wooden surface of the table. The residential security application I had installed when I first moved into the building a year ago was currently sending me a steady, silent stream of push notifications. The very first alert arrived at exactly 6:58 in the morning. The text on the screen was simple and definitive. It read, "Access denied. Electronic fob deactivated." Exactly 30 seconds later, a second notification popped up on the display, "Access denied." And then, less than a minute after that, a third. I slowly looked up from the illuminated screen and stared through the rain-streaked, condensation-covered window of the cafe. Across the wet asphalt, parked illegally and carelessly in the loading zone of my residential building, was my older brother Steven's oversized, black sports utility vehicle. The hazard lights were blinking in a rhythmic, frantic pattern, casting a faint yellow glow against the heavy morning gloom. I watched in absolute silence as the heavy doors of the vehicle swung open, releasing its passengers into the freezing rain. My nephew, Leo, who had just turned 7 years old a few months prior, stepped out onto the wet sidewalk. He was clutching the handle of a small, bright blue rolling suitcase, his shoulders hunched against the cold. Following closely behind him was his 5-year-old sister, Audrey. She was holding a stuffed pink rabbit tightly by its left ear, looking confused and tired. Then came Nicole, my sister-in-law. She stepped out into the freezing Seattle storm dressed entirely for a tropical resort vacation. She wore pristine white fashion sneakers, wide-legged cream-colored trousers, and a thin silk blouse. She even had a pair of oversized, expensive designer sunglasses pushed back onto the top of her head, completely ignoring the sheer absurdity of wearing them under a sky that was practically black with rain clouds. Finally, the heavy driver's side door slammed shut with a dull thud, and Stephen marched aggressively toward the entrance of the building. Even from across the street, I could see the tension radiating from his shoulders. He looked furious, entitled, and impatient. But what caught my attention the most was the passenger side door opening. Out stepped Patricia, my mother. She smoothed down the front of her expensive raincoat, her posture incredibly rigid, her chin lifted high in her signature pose of superiority. She carried herself like a woman who owned the pavement she walked on, marching toward the glass doors of my building as if she were inspecting a property she had just purchased and found lacking. I took a slow, deliberate breath, steadying my heart rate. I am an information technology forensic data analyst. My entire professional career is built on tracking anomalies, exposing hidden financial assets in high-profile corporate divorces, and watching people panic when their carefully hidden digital footprints are finally dragged into the unforgiving light. I am intimately used to watching data points collapse and liars squirm. But right now, sitting in this quiet corner of the coffee shop, I was preparing to watch my own family fail a basic, undeniable security protocol. Behind the thick glass doors of the building lobby, I could clearly see Kevin, the morning security guard, stepping out from behind the massive marble front desk. His posture was perfectly straight, professional, and entirely unyielding. He stood in the dead center of the entrance hall, creating a physical human barrier. And then, sliding smoothly up to the curb, parking directly behind Stephen's illegally placed vehicle, was a black and white police cruiser. There were no flashing red and blue lights, no blaring sirens, no loud announcements over a loudspeaker. There was just the quiet, heavy, undeniable presence of law enforcement arriving exactly when they were requested. The metal of the cold coffee cup felt freezing against my hand. Everything I had calculated was falling into place. I pushed my metal chair back, the legs scraping softly against the tiled floor of the coffee shop. I reached into my pocket, left a crisp $5 bill on the table for the cold drink I had barely touched, and walked out into the heavy rain. I did not run. I did not rush to cross the street. I simply let the freezing water hit my face and soak into the shoulders of my wool coat. I moved with the measured, deliberate pace of a man who already knew the exact ending to the chaotic story currently playing out in front of him. By the time I reached the side entrance of my apartment building, the discreet door specifically designated for oversized packages and discreet deliveries, the scene unfolding inside the main lobby had visibly escalated. I reached into my pocket, pulled out my active electronic key fob, and swiped it against the sensor. The light blinked green, and I slipped quietly through the heavy metal doors, stepping into the dry, climate-controlled air. I positioned myself in the shadows near the mailroom, leaning against the cool wall, observing the chaos without immediately announcing my presence. Through the thick glass partition that separated the mail area from the main entrance, I had a perfect, unobstructed view. I could see Stephen aggressively pressing his index finger into the digital call box panel mounted on the wall. He was jabbing at the illuminated buttons over and over again, as if applying brute physical force to a touchscreen could somehow magically override a system that had deliberately locked him out. In his other hand, he was holding up a small, familiar brass key, waving it violently in Kevin's face. The thick acoustic glass of the modern lobby completely muted their voices, but I did not need to hear the audio to understand exactly what was being screamed. Stephen's face was flushed a deep, angry red, the veins in his neck bulging slightly. He was a man who had gone his entire life accustomed to getting his way simply by being the loudest, most intimidating person in the room. Standing a few feet behind him, Nicole was aggressively tapping the screen of her mobile phone, looking around the expansive lobby with a mixture of profound annoyance and rising panic. The lightweight, tropical resort clothes she wore suddenly looked entirely ridiculous and out of place under the harsh, bright fluorescent lights of the entrance hall. My mother, Patricia, stood slightly to the side, pointing her index finger directly toward the bank of elevators. She was speaking sharply, her mouth moving in rapid, clipped syllables directed at Kevin. She was undoubtedly attempting to use her authoritative, former school principal voice, trying to intimidate him into submission and force him to grant them access to my home. But Kevin did not flinch, not even a fraction of an inch. He stood his ground perfectly, his hands clasped neatly behind his back in a relaxed but ready stance. He slowly shook his head from side to side. He was a former military man with years of security experience, and he handled my mother's escalating demands and my brother's aggressive posturing with the cold, unbothered efficiency of a solid brick wall. Then, the automatic main doors slid open with a soft mechanical hum. The two uniformed police officers I had seen pulling up outside stepped out of the pouring rain and into the dry, heated air of the lobby. Officer Ryan, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a calm, deeply observant face, walked in first. He was followed closely by his partner, Officer Eric, who immediately began scanning the room. The exact moment the silver badges and the dark navy blue uniforms caught the bright lobby lights, the entire atmosphere in the room completely shattered. Stephen instantly froze, his hand still suspended awkwardly in the air, the brass key dangling uselessly from his fingers. Nicole let out a visible gasp and took a sudden, frightened step backward, her expensive sneakers almost tripping over little Audrey's pink rolling suitcase. My mother's commanding, pointing finger slowly lowered to her side, her lips parting in absolute, unadulterated shock. They had fully expected an argument this morning. They had expected me to eventually come downstairs, to cave under their collective pressure, and to surrender to their demands. They had never, not even in their wildest, most paranoid calculations, expected the police to be waiting for them. This was the critical moment. This was the exact, calculated second the long-held illusion of their control over my life evaporated into thin air. I stepped out from the dark shadows of the mailroom and walked slowly, purposefully across the polished marble floor of the main lobby. The sharp sound of my dress shoes echoing in the suddenly silent, tense room instantly drew every single pair of eyes toward me. Stephen was the very first person to see me emerge from the hallway. For a fraction of a second, a fleeting, desperate look of pure relief washed over his flushed face. His tense shoulders dropped slightly, and his chest expanded as he let out a breath he had clearly been holding. In his twisted, incredibly entitled mind, my physical appearance in the lobby meant only one thing. It meant that I had finally come down to surrender. He genuinely believed I was walking toward them to apologize for the inconvenience of the broken key fob, to silently take the children's heavy suitcases, and to usher everyone upstairs to my apartment so he and Nicole could rush to the airport and catch their flight to the sunshine. But as I continued walking closer, my face entirely devoid of emotion, the relief on his face violently vanished, replaced by a sudden, creeping confusion. I was not rushing toward my niece and nephew with open arms. I was not reaching out to grab the handles of their luggage. I deliberately kept my hands casually tucked deep into the pockets of my dark wool coat, my facial expression completely blank, wiped clean of any familial warmth. I stopped walking when I was exactly 10 feet away from their group, ensuring I left a distinct, undeniable physical gap between my personal space and theirs. I was treating them not as family, but as hostile intruders. "There you are," Stephen yelled, his voice echoing sharply against the high, vaulted ceiling of the lobby. He pointed an aggressive finger directly at Kevin. "Tell this guy to let us up right now. We are going to miss our flight, Michael. Tell him to open the elevator." Kevin turned his head slowly, his expression remaining completely neutral as his eyes met mine. His voice was calm, steady, and deeply professional. "Sir," Kevin asked, his tone carrying clearly across the marble floor, "do you authorize these visitors to access your private residence this morning?" The lobby went completely, suffocatingly still. The only sound in the vast room was the faint, muffled rhythm of the heavy rain hitting the thick glass walls outside. I looked at Stephen's demanding, furious face. I looked at Nicole's panicked, wide eyes, darting between me and the police officers. I looked at my mother, Patricia, who was currently glaring at me with an intense, unspoken threat that demanded my immediate obedience. She expected me to fold. She had spent 32 years training me to fold. I did not raise my voice. I did not show even a single ounce of the simmering anger that had kept me awake staring at the ceiling all night. I simply looked Kevin directly in the eye, my voice as cold and hard as the marble floor beneath my feet, and said, "No, I do not authorize them." Nicole let out a sharp, audible gasp, a sound that heavily resembled a balloon rapidly losing air. It was a noise of pure, unfiltered disbelief, as if I had just walked across the room and struck her across the face. Stephen took an aggressive, threatening step forward, his hand balling into a fist, the small brass key practically digging into his palm. "Michael, stop playing this ridiculous game right now," Stephen hissed, his voice dropping an octave as he finally realized the two armed police officers standing near the entrance were watching his every single move. "You know Mom gave me the spare key last night. Stop embarrassing us and just let us upstairs." Officer Ryan stepped smoothly and silently between me and my angry brother. He placed his right hand gently, casually resting on his utility belt. It was a subtle, highly trained gesture, but it commanded absolute, immediate authority. "Sir," the officer said directly to Stephen, his tone flat, firm, and entirely unbothered by the family drama. "The resident of this building has made it perfectly clear you do not have permission to enter the premises." Stephen's jaw clenched so hard I thought I might actually hear his teeth crack. He looked at the police officer, then down at the useless brass key in his hand, and finally, he glared at me with absolute hatred. He was completely trapped, suffocating under the crushing weight of a boundary he could not manipulate, scream at, or break. How did we get to this exact moment? How did a simple piece of cut brass become a weapon of home invasion? To understand exactly why 2 police officers were currently standing in my lobby, physically blocking my own flesh and blood from entering my home, you have to understand the events of the previous night. You have to understand the exact, devastating moment I finally realized my family did not love me at all. They merely loved the unlimited access they had to my resources. The entire chain of events that led to the confrontation in the lobby actually started the night before, at exactly 11:43. The city of Seattle was dark and quiet outside my windows, and my apartment was perfectly, beautifully still. I live entirely alone on the 19th floor of the building, high above the chaotic street noise, surrounded by automated smart lighting, temperature control, and absolute, unbroken silence. It is a highly controlled environment, designed specifically for my peace of mind. There are no brightly colored toys scattered across my expensive hardwood floors. There are no unexpected guests dropping by unannounced. There is no chaos. There is just me, the gentle hum of my computer tower, my glowing dual monitors, and my highly demanding work. I was sitting in my ergonomic office chair, deep into a highly complex forensic data audit for a major corporate client. My eyes were rapidly scanning through endless, mind-numbing rows of digital financial transactions on a massive spreadsheet. I was actively searching for numerical discrepancies, offshore wire transfers, and hidden accounts. I spend my life looking for the kind of digital lies that desperate people tell when they falsely believe no one is looking at the metadata. I am exceptionally good at finding the ugly things people want to keep buried forever. My brain operates like a finely tuned machine during these late-night hours, rapidly processing logic, analyzing patterns, and completely rejecting any form of human emotion. Then, the screen of my personal mobile phone, which was resting face up on the far corner of my glass desk, suddenly lit up. The sudden, bright white light in the dimly lit room instantly broke my intense concentration. I sighed, leaned over, and picked the device up, assuming it was an automated server alert or a late-night email from my boss. Instead, I saw a new text message notification from my older brother, Stephen. It was late, entirely too late for a casual family conversation. I unlocked the screen and opened the message thread, fully expecting a frantic emergency. Perhaps someone was in the hospital or there had been an accident. Instead, what I read on the screen was a direct, unapologetic command. The message simply said, "My 2 kids are coming over tomorrow morning. Watch them." I sat perfectly still in my chair, staring at the glowing white text on the dark screen for a very long time. I read the 2 short sentences over and over again, genuinely waiting for my tired brain to process the missing words that surely must have been left out by mistake. I was waiting to read a simple please. I was waiting for a question mark at the end of the sentence. I was waiting for some sort of logical explanation, or an apology for the incredibly short notice, as to why he firmly believed he possessed the inherent authority to volunteer my entire Friday without seeking my consent. But none of those polite words were there. It was just a cold, hard, arrogant directive from a man who believed my time belonged to him. I placed my thumbs on the digital keyboard and typed out my response. I deliberately kept it brief, clear, completely devoid of emotion, and entirely professional. I answered him exactly how I would deny a fraudulent insurance claim at work. I replied, "No, I am not available." I set the phone back down on the desk face down, naively assuming that would be the absolute end of the interaction. I assumed he would realize his mistake, understand that I was working, scramble to find a professional babysitting service, and leave me in peace for the rest of the night. But almost instantly, before I could even turn my attention back to my monitors, my phone buzzed violently against the glass. I picked it back up. Stephen had already replied. The new message read, "Doesn't matter. Mom gave me your key." When I read those specific words, Something deep inside the center of my chest simply stopped functioning. I did not feel a sudden, hot rush of anger. I did not want to throw my phone against the wall, and I did not want to scream. Instead, a wave of absolute, freezing, terrifying cold washed over my entire body. It was an incredibly paralyzing moment of pure clarity. It was the exact kind of eerie stillness that falls over a dense forest right before a massive, destructive storm hits. I slowly turned my head away from the screens and looked across the length of my dimly lit apartment. I looked all the way down the hallway at my heavy, reinforced front door. Then, I looked at the small, decorative brass hook mounted on the wall near the kitchen counter. It was completely empty. In that frozen, silent moment, staring intensely at that empty brass hook on the wall, I realized a profound and incredibly ugly truth about my existence. This late-night text message exchange was never actually about babysitting my niece and nephew. It was never about family helping family in a time of need. It was entirely about access. It was about my mother and my brother casually reminding me that no matter how far away I moved, no matter how much money I earned, or how secure my building was, they firmly believed they still owned a piece of my life. My private home, my personal time, my hard-earned money, and my peace of mind were considered communal family property. And tonight, they had just decided to cash in their chips. To truly make sense of their blinding, suffocating entitlement, you have to look deeply into the psychological architecture of my family dynamic. As I mentioned, I am a forensic data analyst. I literally spend my days meticulously tracing the complex flow of money, finding carefully hidden bank accounts in messy, high-stakes corporate divorces, and legally exposing the financial abuse committed by the ultra-wealthy. I am professionally trained to spot manipulation, coercion, and fraud from a mile away. The incredibly bitter irony of my life is that I successfully protected massive, faceless corporations from being financially exploited on a daily basis, while remaining completely, willfully blind to the systematic financial exploitation happening right inside my own bloodline. My mother, Patricia, is the grand architect of this toxic dysfunction. She spent 30 long years working as a strict middle school principal, and she never quite learned how to turn that demanding authority off when she came home. She does not converse with her children. She dictates to them. She uses emotional guilt the exact same way a trained sniper uses a high-powered rifle, aiming precisely at your weakest psychological points and pulling the trigger without hesitation. To her, a mother's love is not unconditional. It is a highly transactional currency. She demands absolute, unquestioning loyalty and financial submission in exchange for the absolute bare minimum scraps of maternal affection. Then there is Stephen. He is my older brother by 3 years, the golden child. Stephen is a regional sales manager who treats his entire life like an endless, exhausting networking event. He wears excessively expensive watches, drives a massive, fuel-guzzling luxury sports utility vehicle, and constantly talks loudly about his next big commission check that is supposedly always just around the corner. But right behind that shiny, carefully curated veneer of success, Stephen is entirely financially hollow. He lives dangerously paycheck to paycheck, constantly drowning in high-interest credit card debt simply to maintain a fake public image of wealth he has never actually earned. His wife, Nicole, is certainly no better. She lives her entire life exclusively for the camera lens of her various social media accounts. To her, every single weekend requires a luxury spa trip, a boutique shopping spree, or an aesthetically pleasing, incredibly expensive brunch. She spends money like it flows freely from a tap, completely detached from the horrifying reality of their rapidly sinking bank accounts and mounting debts. And then there is me, the youngest child, the fiercely single brother, the one with absolutely no children and no messy divorce settlements, the one who quietly secured a high-paying technology job and built a stable life. In any normal, healthy family, my hard-won independence and financial stability would be celebrated. But in my family, my independence was immediately weaponized against me. To my mother and brother, my deliberate lack of dependence did not mean I had earned the right to relax and enjoy my money. It meant, in their twisted logic, that I possessed excess capacity. It meant my carefully grown savings account was the designated emergency exit for every single terrible financial decision Stephen and Nicole ever made. When Stephen arrogantly ignored the bright red engine warning lights on his dashboard for months and entirely blew the engine of his luxury car, my savings were expected to cover the massive repair bill. When Nicole maxed out yet another credit card on a frivolous tropical vacation, my year-end corporate bonus was expected to cover the exorbitant minimum payment so they would not default. For years, for over a decade, I had silently accepted this parasitic dynamic. I had rationalized the abuse. I repeatedly told myself that family takes care of family, that this is just what brothers do. I foolishly believed that by continuously paying off their debts and fixing their mistakes, I was being the good son, the reliable, foundational rock of the family. But sitting in the dark that night, the truth finally became crystal clear, and it was far darker than I wanted to admit. My family had officially diagnosed my financial stability as a natural resource they were inherently entitled to harvest. They did not see me as a human being with my own needs and desires. They saw me as a walking, breathing automated teller machine. And the absolute worst part of this realization was knowing that they genuinely, deeply believed they had the moral right to punch in their PIN code and withdraw from my life whenever they deemed it necessary. The small brass key that Stephen was currently holding hostage as a weapon of entry was not acquired by stealth, theft, or deception. That was the most painful part. It was willingly handed over by me in a fleeting moment of misplaced familial trust. Approximately 2 years ago, during a brutally cold winter in Seattle, an old water pipe suddenly burst in the apartment directly above mine. At the time, I was completely unavailable, sitting in a seminar room across the country attending a mandatory cybersecurity conference. Freezing water began rapidly leaking through my ceiling, threatening to destroy thousands of dollars worth of computer equipment. The building management called me frantically, stating they needed immediate, physical access to my unit to shut off the valves and mitigate the severe water damage. In a moment of pure panic, miles away from home, I called my mother. She lived only a 20-minute drive away from the downtown core. I formally authorized the front desk staff to give her my designated emergency spare key, known as the master mechanical backup, so she could enter my home, legally supervise the maintenance crew, and ensure my expensive electronics were moved to a safe, dry corner. She went in, the pipe was successfully fixed, the carpets were dried, and the major crisis was completely averted. When I finally returned to Seattle a week later, exhausted from the trip, I casually asked for the spare key back during our routine Sunday family dinner. Patricia waved her hand dismissively over her plate of expensive roast beef. She casually told me she had left it deep inside her other purse at home and promised she would bring it by my apartment later in the week. Besides, she added, her tone shifting into a perfectly crafted mask of maternal concern, having a spare key nearby with a trusted family member was simply a good, logical safety measure. What if I accidentally locked myself out in the rain? What if there was a sudden medical emergency and I could not reach the door? Her tone was so perfectly laced with fake, loving concern that I stupidly let the issue go. I convinced myself it was just a tiny piece of metal, a simple 2-inch piece of cut brass. I was incredibly busy with a major project at work. I was chronically tired, and engaging in a massive, drawn-out argument with Patricia over a piece of metal seemed like an absolute waste of my limited energy. So the brass key stayed in her purse. Then, presumably, it moved to her kitchen drawer. And eventually, as the months passed by, the existence of that key vanished from my mind entirely. I never, not in a million years, imagined that 24 months later, that exact same piece of metal would be casually handed to my entitled brother like a loaded gun, pointed directly at my sanctuary. To my logical mind, giving her the key was a simple logistical solution to a sudden plumbing emergency. To Patricia's deeply manipulative mind, keeping the key was a quiet, highly calculated acquisition of enemy territory. It was the ultimate physical manifestation of her enduring control over my adult life. In her twisted reality, the simple fact that I eventually stopped asking for it back meant that I had implicitly, silently agreed that my private space was essentially her space. When Stephen texted me that he had the key in his possession, The devastating betrayal I felt was not merely about the impending physical invasion of my apartment the next morning. The betrayal was deeply historical. My mother had saved that specific key, guarding it fiercely in secret for 2 entire years, patiently waiting for the absolute perfect moment to deploy it as a weapon. She knew I had been slowly pulling away from them. She knew I had finally started saying the word no to their endless, small financial requests. The brass key was her ultimate trump card. It was her definitive way of proving to me that no matter how strong I thought my boundaries were, she held the physical power to bypass them and force her will upon me whenever she pleased. I sat motionless in my desk chair, the blue glow of the dual monitors casting long, distorted shadows against the walls of my apartment. The silence of the room no longer felt peaceful. It felt incredibly heavy, suffocating, and violating. They had taken a desperate gesture of trust and coldly weaponized it into a tool for domestic trespassing. The obedient, good son inside me, the one who always bent over backwards to keep the peace, finally took his last breath and died. When you spend your entire professional life meticulously analyzing corrupted data and securing compromised networks, you quickly learn a fundamental truth. Emotional reactions are a severe liability. Screaming at a hacker does not magically fix a massive security breach. Crying over lost files does not magically patch a critical software vulnerability. Only swift, calculated action does. I did not pick up my phone to call Steven and engage in a screaming match. I did not draft a long, emotional text message to my mother to beg her to reconsider her actions. Pleading with these people would only serve to validate their twisted illusion of power. They desperately wanted a fight. They wanted me to get highly emotional because emotion is inherently messy, and in a messy, chaotic argument, they were experts at twisting the narrative and gaslighting me into ultimate submission. I absolutely refused to play their predictable game any longer. I picked up my mobile phone from the desk, but I did not open my text messages or my recent calls list. Instead, I bypassed the communication apps entirely and opened the secure residential portal application for my apartment building. I immediately navigated to the resident security settings panel. With 3 swift, decisive taps of my right thumb, I permanently deleted Patricia, Steven, and Nicole from my pre-approved visitor list, revoking their access to the lobby. Next, I selected the specific digital option for the secondary electronic key fob assigned to my unit. I firmly hit the deactivate button. The automated system prompted me with a warning message to confirm the permanent action. I pressed yes without a single millisecond of hesitation. But my analytical brain knew that a digital software lock was simply not enough to stop them. My mother had physically handed over the brass key, and the deadbolt installed on my front door was old school, mechanical hardware. I opened my contacts list and dialed the direct line to the front desk. Kevin, the reliable guard, was working the overnight shift. When he answered the phone, I consciously kept my voice entirely devoid of panic or anger. I clearly gave him my full name and my specific unit number. I professionally informed him that an unauthorized family member was currently in possession of a physical house key and fully intended to aggressively breach my apartment early the next morning. I explicitly instructed him that under absolutely no circumstances, regardless of the excuses they provided, were they to be allowed past the lobby doors. Kevin's tone on the phone shifted instantly from polite concierge to strict, uncompromising security protocol. He rapidly checked his computer system and verbally confirmed that their names were successfully removed from the access list. Then, I asked him to connect me directly to the 24-hour emergency maintenance line. I informed him that I needed a complete, physical hardware lock change on my front door, and I needed it done immediately. At exactly 12:22 in the morning, a tired but highly efficient emergency maintenance worker arrived at my door carrying a heavy metal toolbox. I stood silently in the hallway, my arms crossed, and watched intensely as he unscrewed the old, compromised deadbolt, the exact lock that my mother's stolen key fit into. I listened to the satisfying, metallic clinking sound of the old screws hitting the hallway floor. Within 20 minutes, a brand new, highly advanced security smart lock was perfectly installed. The worker handed me a small envelope containing a set of 3 new, entirely unique physical keys. I paid the exorbitant emergency service fee, tipped him generously in cash, and firmly locked the door behind him. The heavy, solid clunk of the new deadbolt sliding deeply into the door frame was the most beautiful, comforting sound I had ever heard in my life. I walked back into my office and sat down at my desk. I closed all the corporate audit files on my monitors. I opened a new, entirely blank Word document. I carefully named the file Family Boundary Incident. My fingers began to fly rapidly across the mechanical keyboard. I decided right then and there to treat my family exactly like a hostile, fraudulent corporate entity. I started logging everything. 11:43 at night. Stephen aggressively demands childcare. 11:46 at night. I formally refuse. 11:48 at night. Stephen claims unauthorized possession of my physical house key. 12:22 in the morning. Physical locks completely changed. I was building an impenetrable fortress, not constructed of bricks and mortar, but of undeniable, time-stamped, irrefutable facts. Pure documentation does not feel guilt. Pure documentation cannot be emotionally manipulated by a mother's fake tears or a brother's aggressive anger. I was actively preparing for a war, and my weapon of choice was absolute, cold, hard data. The silence of my apartment at 1 o'clock in the morning was absolute, but the inside of my mind was roaring. Having secured my physical perimeter with the new deadbolt, I needed to secure my reality. When you are raised in a family that constantly gaslights you, twisting facts to fit their narrative, you begin to doubt your own memory. They make you feel crazy for remembering the times they used you. I needed to eliminate that doubt. I needed hard, undeniable data. I turned back to my dual monitors. I closed out of all my corporate security software and opened a secure, encrypted browser window. I logged directly into my primary banking portal, navigating through the two-factor authentication process with practice speed. Once I was in, I bypassed the standard monthly overview and went straight to the raw data export tools. I set the parameters to download every single transaction, every transfer, every wire, and every withdrawal covering the exact span of the last 26 months. The system processed the request, and a massive spreadsheet downloaded to my local drive. I opened it and immediately began applying forensic data filtering techniques. I created a custom search query specifically targeting 3 names: Stephen, Nicole, and Patricia. I wanted to see every single dollar that had flowed from my hard-earned accounts into their chaotic lives. As the software grouped the transactions together, highlighting them in bright yellow rows across my screen, a sickening feeling began to settle deep in the pit of my stomach. Seeing the transfers isolated, stripped of the emotional guilt trips and the fake emergencies that had originally prompted them, was devastating. I highlighted the final column and applied a simple auto-sum formula. The number that flashed across the bottom of the screen was not a mistake. It was exactly $11,600. $11,600. Gone. Drained from my life to fund their irresponsibility. I started typing out a chronological ledger, translating the sterile banking codes into the actual events they represented. I typed out $1,900 for Stephen's luxury sports utility vehicle repair, specifically the repair he needed because he ignored his engine warning light for 6 months. I logged $2,400 to pay off Nicole's high-interest boutique credit card, a payment Stephen begged me to make so his credit score would not tank before they applied for a new loan. I kept going, the anger finally replacing the cold shock. $1,300 to cover the deposit for my nephew Leo's elite summer camp, because my mother insisted he would fall behind his peers if he did not attend, and she heavily implied it was my duty as a childless uncle to provide. $1,100 for Audrey's lavish 5th birthday party, complete with rented entertainment and professional catering they absolutely could not afford. There were dozens of smaller, equally parasitic charges. $700 for emergency groceries when Stephen claimed his paycheck was delayed. For $100 for a hotel deposit Nicole swore she would pay back by the 1st of the month, a month that never arrived. $600 to cover a significantly past due utility bill at my mother's house. Transfer after transfer, lie after lie, all neatly lined up in black and white data cells on my monitor. I was halfway through color coding the specific transactions when the harsh, jarring vibration of my mobile phone broke the silence of the room. It was vibrating against the glass desk. I looked over. The caller identification displayed a single word. Mom. It was almost 2 o'clock in the morning. She never called this late unless someone was dead, or unless someone had dared to challenge her absolute authority. I knew exactly which one this was. I reached for the phone, but I did not answer it immediately. Instead, I picked up my digital tablet, swiped over to the voice recording application, and hit the red record button. I placed the tablet right next to the phone, took a deep breath to steady my heart rate, and pressed the speakerphone icon. I was about to collect the final piece of evidence I needed for my dossier. "Hello?" I said, keeping my voice as flat and completely devoid of emotion as a machine. My mother did not say hello. She did not ask if I was awake, or if she was interrupting anything. She bypassed standard human decency and launched directly into a verbal assault. "What in the world did you just do to the building access system?" Patricia snapped. Her voice was sharp, cutting through the speakerphone like a jagged knife. She spoke to me with the exact same tone she would use to discipline a badly behaved child who had just stolen something precious from her desk. I leaned back in my ergonomic chair, watching the audio waves peak and dip on the recording application of my tablet. "I removed unauthorized access to my private apartment," I replied calmly. "Unauthorized?" She practically spat the word back at me, her anger flaring instantly. "Stephen is your older brother, Michael. He is not some dangerous stranger off the street. He is your family. A brother can still be unauthorized, Mother," I stated, stating a legal and factual truth she refused to accept, especially when he demands access to my home without my consent. That made her absolutely furious. The calculated mask of the caring mother vanished entirely, revealing the controlling tyrant beneath. She raised her voice, the audio clipping slightly on the recording. "2 innocent children are counting on you tomorrow morning, Michael. Nicole is completely exhausted and needs this trip. Stephen has an incredibly important networking retreat for his career, and you are purposefully turning a simple, tiny favor into a massive, ridiculous legal drama. You are being completely unreasonable." I stayed perfectly quiet. I did not interrupt her. Over 32 years of living under her shadow, I had learned a very specific tactical communication strategy. If I simply let my mother talk long enough without challenging her directly, her own arrogance would eventually cause her to say the quiet part out loud. She would eventually reveal the ugly truth she should have kept hidden. And she did exactly that. The silence on my end clearly agitated her. "We planned it this way for a reason, Michael," she huffed, her voice dripping with condescension. "We knew you would immediately say no if we asked you 3 weeks ago. You are always so stubborn and difficult about your schedule. So, I gave Stephen the spare key tonight because I know how you operate. You always resist at first, but you always come around once the kids are actually involved and standing in front of you. You would never turn Leo and Audrey away." I stared at the recording timer ticking away on the tablet screen, feeling my stomach completely drop. It was not a desperate, last-minute emergency like Stephen had originally framed it. It was a highly calculated, premeditated ambush. They had sat down, analyzed my psychological profile, identified my guilt regarding my niece and nephew as a vulnerability, and actively plotted to exploit it. "A key is not consent, Mother," I said, my voice dropping to a near whisper, vibrating with a suppressed, cold rage. "It is a piece of metal. It does not grant you ownership of my property." Patricia let out a short, cold, dismissive laugh. "Do not use that sterile corporate language with me, Michael. You are a son and a brother long before you are whatever fancy technical title your company pays you to be." "I am also a legal tenant," I fired back, my logic slicing through her emotional manipulation. "I am a grown adult, and I am the sole, exclusive person who decides who crosses the threshold of my home." Her voice rose to a near shout, the anger completely consuming her. Living in that expensive downtown tower has made you incredibly selfish, Michael. Men like you, with no wives to care for and no children to provide for, always start thinking your precious free time matters more than everyone else's needs. You think you are better than us because you have money in the bank. The old, familiar weight of her emotional guilt tried to settle into my chest, right where she had carefully planted it decades ago. But then, my eyes drifted back up to the massive spreadsheet glowing on my dual monitors. I looked at the bolded yellow cell containing the final auto sum. $11,600. 26 months of continuous financial bleeding. The guilt evaporated, replaced by the absolute certainty of my data. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the glass desk. Selfish? I repeated the word slowly, tasting the bitter irony of it. Let us talk about exactly how selfish I am. I moved my mouse over to the top of the chronological ledger I had just built. I did not yell. I did not curse. I simply began to read the cold, hard data points out loud into the speakerphone. $1,900, I stated clearly. That was the exact amount I wired directly to the mechanic when Stephen blew the engine of his luxury vehicle because he refused to pay for routine maintenance. Michael, stop this right now, my mother ordered, her tone suddenly shifting from aggressive attack to defensive panic. She hated being confronted with facts she could not emotionally manipulate. I completely ignored her command and continued reading down the screen. $2,400. That was the wire transfer I sent to cover Nicole's boutique credit card debt so Stephen would not get denied his new loan. $1,300 for Leo's summer camp. I told you to stop, Patricia shouted, her voice echoing shrilly in my quiet office. I did not stop. The momentum of the truth was unstoppable. $1,100 to cater Audrey's 5th birthday party. $700 for Stephen's emergency groceries. $400 for a hotel deposit Nicole promised to repay and never did. $600 to keep the lights on at your house when you claimed your pension check was lost in the mail. Michael, she screamed my name, a sound of pure, frustrated desperation. I am not attacking you, Mother, I said calmly, watching the audio waves on the tablet spike wildly with her screams. I am simply being factually accurate. I am reading the historical data of my selfishness. Money was never the point of this conversation, she snapped, desperately trying to pivot the argument away from the undeniable evidence of their exploitation. Money is always the point when any of you need mine, I replied, my voice steady, unyielding, and completely detached from the woman on the other end of the line. You do not want a son. You want a subsidized safety net. And tonight, the net is officially closed. The line went dead silent for 5 long seconds. I could hear her heavy, angry breathing through the speaker. She realized that her usual tactics, the screaming, the guilt-tripping, the gaslighting, were completely failing. Her authority was bouncing off the hard armor of my data. So, she resorted to the absolute last weapon in a toxic parent's arsenal, the nuclear threat of abandonment. Listen to me very carefully, Michael, Patricia said, her voice dropping into a low, terrifyingly calm register. If you do not open that lobby door tomorrow morning, and if you humiliate this family in front of your building staff, do not ever call me your mother again. You will be dead to me. For a brief, agonizing moment, the entire apartment felt like it was plunging into a vacuum. A younger version of myself would have broken right then and there. The old Michael would have scrambled to apologize, terrified of losing the only family he had, terrified of being completely alone in the world. But sitting in the blue glow of my monitors, looking at the thousands of dollars they had stolen from my future, the threat did not break me. Instead, it clarified absolutely everything. It was the final, liberating piece of the puzzle. If being your son means I have to surrender the safety of my home, empty my bank accounts, and give up my fundamental human right to say the word no, I said, my voice echoing with absolute finality, then I can no longer afford the role. The cost of admission is simply too high. You are a cruel, cold monster, she hissed venomously. "Good night, Patricia," I said. I reached out and pressed the red button to end the call. The silence that rushed back into the apartment was deafening. But this time, it was not heavy. Felt clean. It felt like a deep, infected wound had finally been sterilized. My hands were shaking slightly from the massive adrenaline dump, but my eyes were completely dry. I did not shed a single tear. I reached over to the tablet, saved the audio recording, and backed it up to my secure cloud server. The dossier was almost complete. I had the chronological timeline of the unauthorized access attempt. I had the massive spreadsheet detailing $11,600 of financial exploitation. And I had the digital audio recording of the primary architect, Patricia, explicitly confessing to a premeditated ambush and threatening to disown me if I did not submit to a home invasion. There was only one person left in the family dynamic who needed to see the raw data before the inevitable explosion occurred the next morning. My father, David. My father was a complex, tragic figure in our family architecture. He was a quiet, passive man who had spent his entire adult life entirely hidden behind the sprawling pages of the daily newspaper or the loud volume of the evening television news. He was the classic enabler. He never actively participated in my mother's emotional abuse or Stephen's financial demands, but he never once stood up to stop them, either. When Patricia yelled, David simply lowered his head, went out to the garage, and found a meaningless project to tinker with until the screaming stopped. His survival strategy was complete avoidance. I opened a new, highly secure email draft on my primary desktop screen. I exported the massive 26-month financial ledger as a read-only locked document. I attached the audio recording of the phone call with Patricia. I attached the chronological timeline of the security breach at my building. I typed his email address into the recipient line. Then I stared at the blank body of the email. I did not want to write a long, emotional essay begging for his understanding or validation. I just wanted to present the facts to the only person who might still possess a shred of objective reasoning. I typed a single, straightforward sentence. Dad, I want you to look at this data, listen to this audio, and see what actually happened tonight before anyone else in the family tells you who you are supposed to blame. I moved the cursor over the send button and clicked it. The email software made a soft, satisfying whoosh sound as the heavy data packets left my server and flew into the digital ether. I sat back and watched the delivery tracking software I use for sensitive client communications. Exactly 5 minutes later, the status indicator next to my father's name turned bright red. The email had been opened. He was awake. He was looking at the spreadsheet. He was likely listening to the sound of his wife threatening to disown his youngest son over a babysitting dispute. I sat in the dark for 20 entire minutes, my eyes glued to the screen, waiting for the typing indicator to appear. I waited for him to call my phone. I waited for him to finally, after 32 years, step up and be a father. I waited for him to say that he was sorry, that he would handle Patricia, that I did not deserve to be treated like an automated teller machine. The screen remained perfectly still. The phone remained completely silent. He did not reply. Somehow, that absolute, cowardly silence hurt far worse than my mother's violent screaming. Patricia's abuse was active and loud. David's abuse was passive and quiet. But the silence taught me a profound lesson I desperately needed to accept before the sun came up. Silence is not neutral. Silence is an active choice. And my father's lifelong choice to remain silent was the exact foundation that allowed this toxic family structure to be built in the first place. Have you ever felt so deeply exhausted because your own blood relatives treated your love and your success like an unlimited, communal checkbook? That night, staring at the unanswered email, I finally understood the core truth of my existence. Love without fundamental respect is not actually love. It is simply control, cleverly disguised wearing a familiar family name. I closed the laptop, walked into my bedroom, and lay down on top of the covers fully dressed. I slept for exactly 90 minutes before my alarm went off, signaling the start of a Friday morning that would permanently change the trajectory of my entire life. This brings us right back to the freezing, Rain-soaked Friday morning, standing on the polished marble floor of my building's lobby. The atmosphere in the room was highly combustible. Officer Ryan stood firmly between me and my furious brother, his hand resting easily on his utility belt, projecting absolute calm. Officer Eric stood slightly to the side, his eyes scanning Nicole and Patricia, assessing the threat level of the entire group. Stephen, realizing that screaming at me was not going to work with law enforcement present, immediately pivoted to a defensive strategy. He attempted to use the exact same psychological tactic he had used his entire life. Darvo. Deny the bad behavior, attack the victim, and reverse the roles of victim and offender. He wanted to make me look like the unhinged aggressor. Officers, this is completely ridiculous, Stephen scoffed, running a hand through his damp hair, attempting to sound like a perfectly reasonable, exhausted father dealing with a crazy relative. He is their uncle. We are just trying to drop the kids off so my wife and I can get to the airport for a crucial business trip. He knows we are coming. We had an agreement. Officer Ryan did not blink. He looked at Stephen with the practiced, flat stare of a man who had heard every lie in the book. Sir, the officer said, his voice slow and deliberate, I asked if the resident authorized you to enter his private property. I did not ask about his biological relationship to your children. Stephen's fake smile faltered. He was not used to his charm bouncing off people. It is universally understood in our family, he stammered, pointing an accusing finger at me. He always watches them. He is just having some sort of dramatic temper tantrum this morning to get attention. Patricia immediately stepped forward, sensing that Stephen was losing control of the narrative. She put on her best, most diplomatic former principal voice, the one designed to placate angry parents and unruly students. Officers, please, Patricia said, offering a tight, condescending smile. I apologize for the disturbance. This is simply a private, internal family misunderstanding. My sons are just having a petty disagreement. There is absolutely no need for law enforcement to be involved in a simple miscommunication. A family misunderstanding? I asked, my voice cutting through the lobby like a shard of ice. I did not look at her. I kept my eyes locked on the police. I reached into the deep pocket of my wool coat and pulled out my mobile phone. I unlocked the screen, opened the exact text message thread from the night before, and handed the device directly to Officer Ryan. Officer, I said clearly, ensuring my voice carried to every corner of the silent lobby. Please read the message received at 11:43 last night, and my explicit response sent 3 minutes later. Officer Ryan took the phone. He looked down at the bright screen. He read the text out loud, his deep voice carrying zero emotion. Message reads, my 2 kids are coming over tomorrow morning. Watch them. Response reads, no, I am not available. The officer looked up from the screen, his eyes locking onto Stephen's suddenly pale face. The Darvo strategy was collapsing in real time. Documentation was doing its job. Officer Eric stepped forward, crossing his arms over his armored chest. He looked directly at Patricia, completely rejecting her attempt to minimize the situation. Ma'am, Officer Eric said, his tone entirely devoid of sympathy. A family misunderstanding does not grant anyone the legal right to bypass security protocols and attempt to illegally enter a private residence after being explicitly denied access by the legal tenant. Patricia's face tightened, her diplomatic mask slipping to reveal the furious tyrant underneath. She realized she could not control the police, so she turned her absolute rage toward the only target she thought she still owned. Michael, you are humiliating us in front of these strangers, she hissed, her voice vibrating with venom. You are making a massive scene over absolutely nothing. Tell them to leave. No, Patricia, I replied, my voice perfectly steady, using her first name to sever the maternal connection. You meticulously planned to use my home as a free storage facility without my consent. You planned to force your will upon me. I am simply refusing to help you hide your unacceptable behavior anymore. The consequences of your actions are now public. The harsh reality of the situation finally seemed to penetrate the minds of the children. My young nephew, Leo, who had been standing quietly by his blue suitcase, suddenly began to cry. It was not a loud, dramatic wail, but a series of quiet, exhausted, terrified little sobs. His small shoulders shook under his damp jacket. Hearing him cry was the only thing that managed to crack my armor. I felt a sharp ache in my chest. I took 2 slow steps toward him and crouched down, maintaining a respectful distance so I did not crowd him, but getting on his eye level. "Hey, buddy," I said softly, my voice changing entirely, losing the cold, corporate edge. "Listen to me very carefully. You are not in any trouble. Absolutely none of this is your fault. Okay? You are a good kid." Stephen violently snapped. The sight of me comforting the son he had just used as a pawn was completely intolerable to his fragile ego. "Do not talk to him like you actually care about him, you selfish prick," Stephen roared, taking a threatening lunge forward. Officer Ryan instantly stepped into the gap, placing a firm, heavy hand squarely on the center of Stephen's chest, physically stopping his forward momentum. "Sir, I strongly advise you to step back and lower your voice immediately, or you will be placed in handcuffs," the officer warned, his hand moving closer to his handcuffs. I slowly stood back up, my face returning to an expressionless mask. Nicole, standing behind her husband, began frantically whispering in his ear. "Stephen, they are going to arrest you. The flight. We are going to miss boarding for the flight." Stephen ripped his phone out of his pocket, his hands shaking violently with rage and adrenaline. He started furiously tapping the screen, likely frantically searching the internet for an emergency, same-day babysitting service, or desperately scrolling through his contacts to find someone else he could dump his manufactured crisis onto. The illusion of their absolute power was shattered. The cold, hard reality of the law had completely neutralized their emotional manipulation. They were exposed. My mother, realizing that Stephen was completely neutralized and Nicole was panicking, tried one absolute last, desperate maneuver. She squared her shoulders and looked at me with a gaze designed to shatter my resolve. "You are choosing a piece of metal hardware over your own flesh and blood, Michael," Patricia said, her voice dripping with historical guilt. "You are choosing a lock over your family." "No," I corrected her, my voice echoing loudly in the lobby. "I am choosing basic consent over your absolute control." The lobby went completely, uncomfortably quiet. A man in a tailored business suit waiting near the elevators suddenly found his shoes fascinating, staring intensely at the floor. A woman carrying a rolled-up yoga mat stopped pretending to check her mail and openly stared at the spectacle. My family was being publicly audited, and the entire building was watching. Kevin, the security guard, who had been typing rapidly on his terminal at the front desk, printed out a single sheet of paper. He walked over and handed it to Officer Ryan. "Officers," Kevin announced clearly, "due to the attempted unauthorized entry, the verbal harassment of the resident, and the general disturbance in the lobby, building management has officially mandated that Stephen, Nicole, and Patricia are permanently trespassed from this property. If they return, they will be arrested for trespassing." Officer Eric nodded in agreement, then looked directly at Stephen and Nicole, delivering the final, devastating legal blow. "Furthermore," Officer Eric added, his voice carrying the heavy weight of the law, "if you decide to leave these 2 minor children in this lobby, or if you attempt to leave them anywhere on this property after the resident has explicitly refused to take custody of them, we will not just write a trespassing ticket. The incident will be formally documented as a severe abandonment concern, and Child Protective Services will be called immediately." Nicole's face went completely, shockingly pale. All the color drained from her cheeks, making her designer sunglasses look utterly ridiculous against her ghostly skin. She let out a small, terrified squeak. That was the exact moment the tectonic plates of our family dynamic permanently shifted. That was the moment they finally, truly realized that the massive world outside of our toxic family bubble did not recognize Patricia's rules, did not care about Stephen's fake wealth, and absolutely would not tolerate their abuse. The law of the land superseded the law of the mother. Stephen immediately stopped yelling. He looked terrified. A child abandonment charge would instantly destroy his corporate sales career and trigger a massive investigation into his already fragile life. Nicole practically dove onto her phone, her fingers flying across the screen as she frantically dialed a premium, incredibly expensive emergency child care service, loudly begging the operator for a same-day appointment regardless of the cost. The fortress I had built out of digital data and cold logic had held. The attack was repelled. I had won. Patricia realized the battle was entirely lost. She had no leverage, no authority, and no willing victim. She slowly turned her head and looked at me. The expression on her face was one of pure, unadulterated hatred. It was a look completely devoid of maternal warmth or love. It was the look of a defeated tyrant staring at a slave who had successfully broken their chains. "You are no son of mine," Patricia hissed, delivering the exact threat she had promised on the phone the night before. She meant it to be a fatal emotional strike. She wanted me to collapse in tears. Instead, I looked right back into her cold eyes, feeling absolutely nothing but a profound sense of relief. "Then I suggest you stop trying to use my apartment like I am," I replied evenly. Exactly 15 minutes later, the chaotic scene finally dismantled itself. Stephen, looking utterly defeated and humiliated, violently dragged the 2 rolling suitcases back out into the freezing rain, throwing them into the trunk of the sports utility vehicle. Nicole was trailing behind him, practically crying into her mobile phone as she desperately argued with a receptionist about exorbitant same-day sitter rates and non-refundable flight change fees. Patricia walked out of the glass doors first, her back incredibly stiff, her face furious and unyielding. She did not look back. But as my niece, Audrey, walked toward the exit, she stopped for a brief second. She turned around, looked at me standing near the mailroom, and lifted her small, trembling hand. She gave me a tiny, sad wave. I lifted my hand and waved back gently. That single moment, that tiny wave from a confused 5-year-old girl, hurt far worse than anything my mother or brother had screamed at me. That was the true collateral damage of their entitlement. When the heavy glass doors finally slid shut and locked behind them, sealing them out in the rain, the expansive lobby became strangely, beautifully peaceful. The tension evaporated from the air. Officer Ryan walked over, handed me a professional business card with a handwritten incident report number on the back, and advised me to keep all my digital documentation secure in case they attempted retaliation. Kevin walked back behind the marble desk, adjusted his tie, and asked me quietly if I was okay. I looked at him, nodded slowly, and said yes, but my own voice sounded strange to my ears, like it belonged to a completely different person. I walked into the empty elevator and rode the 19 floors up in absolute silence. I stepped into my apartment, closed the heavy door behind me, and engaged the new, secure smart lock. The mechanical clunk echoed in the hallway. I leaned my back against the solid wood of the door, closed my eyes, and slowly slid down until I was sitting on the hardwood floor. I sat there in the quiet, safe darkness until my legs finally stopped shaking from the adrenaline. For the first hour after they vanished into the rain, I did absolutely nothing. I remained sitting on the floor by my reinforced front door, my heavy wool coat still on, my phone resting face down on the wood beside me. My apartment was utterly silent, the exact kind of peaceful silence I used to love, but now the quiet felt massive and heavy. Every time I closed my eyes, I kept seeing the flashing images of the morning. The panic in Nicole's eyes when the police mentioned child abandonment, the absolute venom in Patricia's voice, and Audrey's tiny, confused wave. Then the digital assault began. My phone started vibrating against the floorboards. First it was Stephen, then Patricia, then Stephen again. I picked it up and saw a barrage of text messages flooding the screen. "You made my kids cry. You completely embarrassed us in front of the cops. You owe us $1,000 for the flight rebooking fees. You are clinically insane and you need psychiatric help." I did not open a single message. I systematically muted the entire text thread. At exactly 1 o'clock in the afternoon, my younger cousin, Sophia, sent me a direct message containing a single screenshot and one sentence of text. Please tell me this is not from today. I opened the image. It was a screenshot of Nicole's public Instagram story. The picture showed a sparkling blue resort pool, towering green palm trees, 2 expensive-looking tropical cocktails, and a neon VIP wristband strapped to Nicole's wrist. The geographic location tag explicitly read, San Diego, California. The caption typed across the bottom of the photo read, finally choosing peace and leaving toxic energy behind. I stared at the bright, highly filtered image until a strange sound escaped my throat. I started laughing. It was not a happy, joyful laugh. It was a dark, hollow sound. It is the exact physical noise your body makes when a massive lie becomes so blatantly, aggressively obvious that it actually stops hurting and just becomes purely absurd. They had easily made the flight, or they had simply paid to change it. The world had not ended. The children had not been abandoned to fate. Stephen and Nicole had miraculously found a financial solution. The absolute second law enforcement informed them that I was no longer a viable option. An hour later, Patricia posted a long, dramatic status update on her Facebook page. She did not use my name, but in a toxic family system, she did not have to. The post read, "Some mothers sacrifice their entire lives to give everything to their children, only to be punished in their golden years with unimaginable cruelty and selfishness. Please pray for a mother whose heart was completely broken by her own blood today." The comments from her ignorant friends flooded in immediately, calling her a strong survivor and lamenting how selfish modern adult children had become. For about 30 agonizing seconds, my fingers hovered over the keyboard. I desperately wanted to comment, to scream the truth into the digital void. But I stopped myself. Patricia desperately wanted a public, emotional, messy fight. She thrived in chaos. She was an expert at playing the victim. But I was an expert at forensic evidence. I opened my laptop. I opened the folder named Family Boundary Incident. I added the police incident report number. I added the screenshot of Nicole's resort cocktails. I added the screenshots of Stephen's abusive text messages. I added the audio file of my mother explicitly threatening me. And finally, I attached the massive 26-month financial spreadsheet detailing the $11,600 they had drained from me. I wrote one incredibly calm, entirely factual message, and I sent it simultaneously to my aunt, my uncle, my cousin Sophia, and the extended family group chat. The message read, "You may hear rumors that I abandoned my niece and nephew to the police this morning. That is factually incorrect. I was ordered, not asked, to babysit at midnight. I refused in writing. My mother gave Stephen a stolen key to my apartment without my consent. They attempted a home invasion. Building security and the police were present to enforce my legal rights as a tenant. I am not asking anyone to fight my battles or take my side. I simply want the objective facts permanently documented." Then I hit send and I dropped the nuclear bomb of truth onto my family tree. Exactly 23 minutes after I sent the email, the extended family group chat completely exploded. My aunt was the first person to respond. She typed in all capital letters, "Patricia, why in the world did Stephen have Michael's private house key?" My mother frantically replied that people were maliciously twisting a private, internal family matter out of proportion. My uncle quickly fired back. "A private matter? Patricia, there is a literal police incident report number attached to this email." Then, my cousin Sophia uploaded the saved screenshot of Nicole drinking cocktails at the San Diego resort, publicly exposing the lie that they had no other options for the children. The entire family dynamic was unraveling in real time. But the absolute fatal blow came from my father, David. The man who had been completely silent for 32 years finally typed a message into the group chat. It was only one sentence, but it carried the weight of a collapsing empire. He wrote, "Michael clearly said no last night, and that should have been the absolute end of the conversation." I stared at those words on the screen until my vision blurred. It was not a grand apology. It did not magically erase decades of enabling and silent complicity, but it was the very first time in my entire existence that he had publicly contradicted Patricia in front of the extended family. Patricia immediately left the group chat. Nicole frantically deleted her resort photos, but the internet is forever, and Sophia had already saved them. Stephen sent me one final, furious private text message. "I hope you are really proud of yourself for destroying this family." I did not respond. I permanently blocked his number. Pride was not the emotion I was feeling. Total, absolute relief was much closer to the truth. That afternoon, sitting in the quiet safety of my apartment, I learned a very expensive lesson. I learned that maintaining a fake peace within a toxic family is incredibly costly. It drains your time, it empties your bank accounts, it violates your privacy, and eventually it completely bankrupts your self-respect. I opened my secure banking application again. The first action I took was locating the recurring automated transfer established for my mother. $200, scheduled for the first of every single month, vaguely labeled as household assistance. I had set it up years ago when she dramatically claimed that groceries and medical prescriptions were getting too difficult to manage on her pension. I had not thought about that transfer in almost a year. It just quietly bled out of my account every month, like a hidden leak behind a wall. I clicked the cancel button. I waited for the crushing wave of guilt to hit me. A small pang arrived, but it was incredibly weak, easily pushed aside by the memory of her screaming at me. Next, I logged into my streaming services and completely permanently deleted the family profile that Stephen and Nicole had been using for free for 5 years. I logged into my Warehouse Club application and formally revoked Nicole's access to my membership account. I changed every single password connected to my apartment portals, my banking apps, my mobile phone plan, my food delivery services, and my medical emergency contacts. I removed Patricia as my next of kin. I called the building manager's corporate office and confirmed, via legally binding email, that no biological member of my family was ever allowed access to my unit under any circumstances. By the time the sun finally set over the Seattle skyline that Friday evening, painting the clouds in shades of bruised purple and dark orange, the physical layout of my life looked exactly the same. But internally, fundamentally, it felt entirely different. It felt like I had changed the locks on a lot more than just my front door. I had finally locked them out of my mind. The immediate aftermath was predictably chaotic, but entirely manageable because I refused to engage. Patricia attempted to call me from various unknown phone numbers for 3 consecutive days. I ignored them all. Stephen, realizing his text messages were blocked, resorted to sending long, rambling emails to my personal account. The emails always started out incredibly angry, then slowly shifted into a tone of wounded victimhood, and inevitably, predictably, ended with a demand for money. He genuinely wanted me to reimburse him for the emergency babysitter and the exorbitant flight change fees because, in his deeply flawed logic, my selfish stunt at the building had created the entire expense. I sent his email address directly to my spam folder. Exactly 1 week later, I booked an appointment with a licensed cognitive behavioral therapist. I initially lied to myself, claiming I just needed a professional sounding board to process the adrenaline of the police incident. But within 20 minutes of sitting on the leather couch in her office, I was completely unraveling. I found myself talking rapidly about being 16 years old and handing over half of my meager grocery store paycheck to my mother because Stephen desperately needed gas money for his car. I talked about buying expensive Christmas gifts for the family and never receiving so much as a thank you card. I talked about the agonizing family dinners where Patricia would shower Stephen with praise simply for showing up, completely ignoring the fact that I had quietly paid for the entire meal. The therapist listened patiently, taking meticulous notes. When I finally stopped talking, she looked at me and said a single sentence that made my blood run cold. She said, "Michael, your family intentionally manufactured a dynamic that forced you to become their permanent safety net. And then, to ensure you never tried to escape, they heavily weaponized the concept of love, so you would never dare question the massive weight you were carrying. I had spent my entire adult life falsely believing I was incredibly strong simply because everyone around me leaned on me for support. I had never once stopped to consider the devastating reality that maybe I was constantly exhausted because they were never supposed to lean on me that heavily in the first place. After that session, I began practicing small, radical acts of personal ownership. I went online and purchased the expensive, high-end ergonomic office chair I had wanted for 8 months, instead of guiltily transferring that money into a savings account earmarked for Steven's next inevitable emergency. I joined a high-intensity boxing gym located 2 blocks away from my building, discovering very quickly that violently hitting a heavy leather bag for 45 minutes straight did significantly more to process my lingering anger than pretending I was completely above it. I took a spontaneous weekend trip down to Portland, Oregon, with a close friend from college. For 3 entire days, we ate incredibly overpriced ramen, walked slowly through massive independent bookstores, and drank entirely too much coffee. And for the very first time in over a decade, I did not check my phone every 10 minutes in a cold panic, terrified of missing a manufactured family crisis. I bought something completely unnecessary for myself and did not immediately mentally compare the cost to one of Steven's unpaid bills. 3 weeks after the incident in the lobby, my mobile phone rang. The caller identification displayed David, my father. I stared at the screen for a long time. I almost let it go to voicemail. When I finally pressed accept, the line was quiet for a moment. Then he said my name, his voice thick with emotion, sounding like he had spent hours practicing the word. Michael. Silence stretched between us. Finally, he spoke. I read the email. I read every single line of the spreadsheet. I listened to the audio recording of your mother. He paused, taking a shaky breath. I should have stepped in and stopped this years ago. I am so incredibly sorry, son. My throat tightened painfully. He explained that he had cowardly convinced himself it was none of his business because I was a successful adult, but he admitted that was just a pathetic excuse. It was simply easier to hide in the garage and let Patricia aggressively run the family than to ever challenge her authority. Then, he said the exact words I did not even know I desperately needed to hear. You were absolutely right to change the locks, Michael. You did the right thing. I pressed the palm of my hand hard over my eyes and said nothing. David did not magically become a completely different, heroic man overnight. But he offered a genuine apology without demanding that I comfort him, without making excuses, and without asking for money. And in my deeply flawed family, that mattered immensely. Exactly 1 year after the rainy Friday morning in the lobby, my life looked vastly different. The corporate data audit I had finished the night my family attempted to breach my apartment was highly successful. It directly led to a massive promotion. I was elevated to the position of senior compliance lead for the entire Western region. The promotion came with significantly better pay, total control over my projects, and a savings account that grew so rapidly that unexpected financial emergencies no longer felt like terrifying storms battering against my front door. I moved out of the 19th floor and upgraded into a much larger, brighter apartment 7 floors higher in the exact same building. It had a dedicated home office, a massive dining table, and floor-to-ceiling windows that perfectly caught the vibrant orange sunsets over the Seattle skyline. For years, money had essentially passed right through my hands, acting as if I was merely holding onto it until someone else in my family needed it more. Now, as I watched my wealth securely grow, I felt something far deeper and more profound than basic comfort. I felt tangible evidence. I felt the absolute mathematical proof that my life functioned perfectly well when I stopped actively funding other people's deliberate refusal to plan for their own futures. The consequences for Stephen and Nicole were severe, but necessary. They were finally forced to adjust to reality because the bank of Michael was permanently closed. Without my massive financial injections, the illusion collapsed. They were forced to sell the luxury sports utility vehicle and purchase a reliable, used sedan. Nicole had to swallow her pride, increase her hours at the boutique, and completely stop posting photographs of expensive restaurant meals as if consuming luxury food was a personality trait. Stephen became significantly quieter in family group settings, no longer arrogantly bragging about his phantom commissions, painfully aware that the entire extended family now knew the embarrassing truth about his massive debts. My mother, Patricia, changed the absolute least. Narcissists rarely do. She still actively posted vague, passive-aggressive quotes on social media about the importance of family loyalty and the tragedy of ungrateful children. She still firmly believed that true forgiveness simply meant everyone completely submitting and returning to the subservient roles she preferred. But the critical difference was that the extended family listened to her entirely differently now. The spreadsheet I had sent out had permanently destroyed her credibility. Her voice still possessed volume, but it had entirely lost its automatic, unquestioned power. The next time I saw all of them in the same room was at my cousin Sophia's wedding, held at a beautiful vineyard outside the city. I arrived wearing a sharp navy blue suit. I arrived entirely alone, and for the very first time in my life, the word alone did not feel like an insult or a failure. Felt incredibly peaceful. During the evening cocktail hour, Stephen slowly approached me near the hallway leading to the patio. Nicole stayed far behind him, anxiously holding little Leo's hand. Stephen nervously cleared his throat, looking everywhere except directly into my eyes. "The kids really miss their uncle," Stephen muttered quietly, swirling the ice in his drink. I looked past him, making eye contact with Leo, and smiled genuinely. "I miss them too," I replied honestly. I still loved my nephew and niece. I simply refused to be extorted through them. Stephen shifted his weight uncomfortably. He stared down at his scuffed dress shoes. "I never should have brought them to your building that morning, Michael. I was out of line." It was not a complete, comprehensive apology for the decade of financial abuse, the massive entitlement, the stolen key, or the way he happily let our mother turn me into the family villain. But it was one single, undeniably true sentence. And sometimes one true sentence is the exact place where genuine accountability has to start. "No, Stephen," I said, my voice calm and completely free of anger. "You really should not have." He nodded silently, accepting the boundary without an argument, without a performance, and walked away. Later that night, standing in the new, quiet expanse of my beautiful apartment, I reached into my pocket and pulled out my keys. I held the shiny, heavy metal in the palm of my hand. Healing is a very strange, non-linear process. It rarely looks like the movies, where everyone cries, apologizes profusely, and sits around a giant dinner table laughing together. Sometimes, genuine healing looks like maintaining a massive physical distance. Sometimes it looks like a blissfully quiet mobile phone that does not ring with manufactured emergencies. And sometimes, it simply looks like spending your own hard-earned money on your own beautiful life, without ever asking for invisible permission from the toxic people who spent decades training you to feel selfish for existing. I did not maliciously destroy my family. I did not cruelly punish innocent children. I simply stopped confusing the concept of love with the concept of unlimited, unauthorized access. Establishing firm boundaries is never an act of selfishness. It is the highest form of self-respect. And ultimate self-respect is the exact mechanism that teaches everyone around you exactly how the rules of responsibility are supposed to work. I placed my keys on the counter, turned off the lights, and went to sleep, completely unbroken, and finally truly free.